Hey everyone, welcome to Thinking Christian, and in this video what I want to do is talk about what I consider my 3 intellectual reasons for rejecting God when I was a skeptic, and why, and I use the term intellectual in quotes because while I thought these were good reasons at the time, and they're certainly not bad reasons. They're certainly not, and I'm going to make another video on my sort of embarrassing or emotional type of reasons that were not, related to reason or anything like that. But instead, what I'm going to be looking at here is why these reasons that I had given, despite the fact that I think I had reasonable intentions in the most case, actually were based on a lot of faulty assumptions. And these were assumptions I needed to sort of start questioning. And as I became more skeptical of my own skepticism, why these reasons eventually failed and why I eventually came to believe in God. Now, my point here is not to try to convince anyone that God exists, nor to try to argue that this is the reasoning behind all skeptics or anything like that. I would hope if you're a skeptic, and if you are, let me know what your reasons for not believing in God are in the comments. I'm not here to try to change your mind per se, but you probably are going to have different reasons than I did. These were the 3 reasons, however, that I would give for my non-belief in God. I don't know if I was ever an atheist, but definitely was an agnostic. So the difference between disbelief and non-belief, there was kind of a non-belief element. I don't ever think, maybe there were times I was a disbeliever, but most of the time it was just non-belief. Like, I don't think there's, a God. And the first reason was just a lack of evidence. But I use the word evidence in quotes here because I was using evidence in an improper way. So I was narrowly and incorrectly defining evidence, and I'll talk about that. The second reason was an assumption that moral realism was coherent outside of theism. This is a more serious way of saying the idea that basically you can have good without God, without the existence of God. We'll get more into that. And then reason number 3 was the assumption that reason itself could function independently of God. Now, it's not that these reasons necessarily, I came to take the opposite stance on them, but these were assumptions that I did need to challenge, that in all 3 cases I had sort of accepted uncritically, and I'll talk about where that was the case. One thing that was interesting and what prompted me to make this video is I was reading a book that quoted the philosopher and historian David Wootton, and Wootton basically said, look, there are 2 preconditions for the emergence of unbelief or skepticism with respect to religious doctrines, and he's specifically looking at Christianity. And the first one is that the idea that unbelievers and skeptics can be a good moral character. This is similar to my reason number 2, although I don't know of any Christians who really take the view that unbelievers and skeptics can't do good things or can't have a good character. It's really, the question is more about moral ontology and moral epistemology than it is about, what the actions one can do. And then number 2 would be new concepts in evidence and probability, which I should mention, most of which were developed by Christians. But these new concepts, especially in Bayesian epistemology, that led to questions like, can the truth of Christianity be demonstrated? Is it supported by authority? Is it likely that the gospel narrative is accurate? And how good is the evidence for God's existence? And I think Wootton's point is these were not the kinds of questions that people historically thought. Now, I think most of the time we think asking these questions are a good thing, that, hey, is this something that we have evidence for belief? And I don't even think that's necessarily a negative thing, but I want to talk about the areas in which this particular idea that everything needs to be, rationally justified for us to believe in it may be more of a product of modernity and maybe even more relative than we like to think. So we'll talk about that as well. Let's go first into my first reason, which was a lack of evidence. I didn't think there was enough evidence, and I thought if God existed, he would have provided us with more evidence for his existence if we were going to come to believe that God existed. The problem that I had, the reason this reason fell apart for me, was that I was narrowly defining evidence in a way that basically a priori ruled out things that would count as evidence for God. So I was basically saying, I'm going to define evidence in this narrow, specific way, and these are things that, and I didn't realize I wasn't doing this on purpose, but I was sort of ruling out things that were evidence for God, and I was looking in such a narrow scope and expecting God to exist in this little natural bubble. And I really needed to have a larger idea of what God was, Basically, I had a flawed epistemology. And what this flawed epistemology was is I was a naive scientific realist. So if you had asked me these things, I would have basically said, yeah, science produces truth. Science is the way we come to knowledge. There's this link between science, knowledge, and truth. This is something I really needed to start asking questions. And part of it is me becoming a researcher that caused me to start realizing that this my idea and perhaps my unhealthy worship of science was not based on really coming to the correct conclusions, right? So really, I just kind of bought into this because this is what the general cultural attitude around me was, going to, secular public school. And I just bought into it uncritically. It's not that I really was like, does science produce truth? Is it possible that science can produce a model that's not necessarily true, but is useful? I never really asked these questions. I just sort of bought into this stuff. There were two questions here. The first is circular reasoning. So if I'm going to claim science produces truth, is that a scientific statement? No, that's not. You can't prove that with science, or you would be presupposing that science produced truth in the first place. So that actually, that'd be circular reasoning. That would be a fallacy. Really what you need to say is that's an epistemic or metaphysical assumption about the nature of science rather than it being science itself. The second problem is there's really not a clear definition of what science is. And there's a reason that, and I'll talk about this more in a minute, but there's a reason most philosophers of science have sort of given up the idea of the demarcation problem that we like to see. So the idea that, okay, we can clearly define science and pseudoscience by one particular thing, whether it's falsifiability, adherence to the scientific method. I think most of the people in philosophy of science have now decided that, okay, this was just kind of hopelessly flawed. It's way more complicated than this. We can generally have an idea of some things that are pseudoscience and not, but creating a very simple set of necessary and sufficient conditions is often done with some other agenda that is not scientific or truth-seeking. It's usually done for funding reasons or political reasons or other sorts of reasons. So I kind of bought into this as well. One of the things that I started doing, and I accepted evolution. I do accept evolution for sure, and I think Christians ought to do this. But what I started realizing was the type of neo-Darwinian materialistic reductionism that I had assumed people meant when they said evolution was actually subject to a lot of political pressures. So if you just do some research into T.H. Huxley, look into the X Club, these were people that had a specific anti-religious agenda, and they had a lot of political power in shaping the scientific landscape, in basically deciding what things were taught, what departments were established. And these were people that really had a goal of trying to get rid of religion or religious beliefs. And I started realizing, oh my gosh, some of the ideas that I'm presented with part of that's not to say it's all political or they're bad intentions, but there's a political angle. It's not just because this is what people agree on or these are the best reasons, but there are other reasons why I could be presented with this side of the story and not this other one that has less to do with whether or not it's true and more to do with what are the personal or cultural preferences of people who are constructing these things have to say, the people that are in a position of power. So these were questions I needed to ask. The other problem, and I'll talk about this more in my other video when I talk about my embarrassing reasons, was at the time I was really, I had this idea of loving science because it gave me a way to feel superior to other people, made me feel smarter than other people. I didn't understand what science was. I just, all I'd taken were like high school science classes. I hadn't done any PhD work. Now I have like peer-reviewed research papers in scientific journals. So now I actually understand how science is done. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like my idea of science was serving a functional role that had less to do with how science is actually done, because I didn't understand what it was at the time, and more to do with whether or not I just liked feeling better than other people. And that was an issue that I needed to address as well, but not really the content of this view. But once again, really this idea of scientific realism, science produces truth. People who think this, just look into this, just any small cursory view. I'll have a link to a Stanford Encyclopedia article on scientific realism that talks about challenges to this. And that's not to say science isn't a good or a useful way of coming to truth or coming to approximate truth, but the link between science and truth is not as straightforward as we often like or want it to be, perhaps. And that's okay. I mean, that's why science provides a good methodology. But this is not a video on science, so I think I've said enough about that. One of the things I realized is that there's kind of a rock and a hard place for scientific realism. I started having this realization and becoming skeptical of this, when I was a skeptic. Either science is bound by an assumed or a methodological naturalism, or it is not. If it is bound by a methodological naturalism, it can't consider or evaluate other competing hypotheses. So this would mean if science a priori rules out things like intelligent design because intelligent design validates methodological naturalism, what this means is that science only produces truth insofar as methodological naturalism is a true state of affairs. But that's not justified because it's true. It's basically justified by a definitional reason that doesn't really have much to do with whether or not it's true. And you can't justify whether or not methodological naturalism is true through science because, once again, that would be circular reasoning. So either science is bound by naturalism, which means it a priori rules out other types of hypotheses that could possibly be true by its own nature, or it's not bound by naturalism, but then we ask the question, why this focus on methodological naturalism and the demarcation problem, which, like I said, most philosophers of science have indeed given up on in this traditional way that we've seen it in the last 100 years. Why all this war about things like intelligent design in classrooms? Why are there high-profile scientists like Thomas Nagel, Antony Flew, who are actually encouraging teaching intelligent design? Once again, this has nothing to do with intelligent design as a theory, but more to do with just whether or not methodological naturalism is a useful thing. And once again, if science is bound by these assumptions or constraints a priori, it can't non-circularly justify them. We should be skeptical if its results are true rather than just being useful. This is my link to the Stanford Encyclopedia philosophy article on scientific realism. This has some challenges to the idea that science produces truth, that statement. Look into that article, very interesting article. My goal is not to have you distrust science, but to maybe be healthily skeptical of the results of science and realize that science produces truth is a metaphysical assumption and it's kind of not needed to do science. And this is where I say there's a difference between scientific instrumentalism and scientific realism. Scientific instrumentalism is basically the idea that science produces models that are generally true under so-and-so condition and are useful for building stuff and doing stuff, but we don't really have to talk about whether or not it's true. You can talk about more or less accurate, but absolutely true. That's a metaphysical assumption and it's difficult to justify. So realism versus instrumentalism, you can be an instrumentalist. It's a very healthy view, I think, and still do a lot of great research, but avoid some of these thorny philosophical or metaphysical issues that, frankly, most scientists do not understand and have a poor grasp of, and I think that's actually problematic. But I say this as a researcher who definitely knows a lot more about scientific research than philosophy, but I know enough to know that myself and many other scientists don't understand this distinction well enough to be commenting on it. I'll say that. So basically, what I'll say is I had this positivist view on scientific evidence and falsification, and it was something I just uncritically accepted, and I didn't think about its flaws, the circularity flaws, these other socially constructed challenges to it. And as a result, I was kind of acting like a child when I was like telling God, hey, if you exist, you will conform to my naive epistemic limits, which is kind of like saying, Mom, if you exist or you love me, you'll demonstrate it to me by buying me a PS5. Let's say my mom wanted to buy me a PS5 and she does love me and she does exist. These are all true things. It would put her in a difficult position because even if she wanted to do it, her buying me a PS5 when I make this constraint would be her enabling me to have an unhealthy view of love or existence, or really trying to be manipulative. Even if I didn't realize I was trying to be manipulative, I was being manipulative because I had a really small and incorrect view of what love or existence was. And in a similar way, I'm really glad that God didn't spell out his name in the stars or anything like this, what I thought at the time would convince me. Oh, God, if you exist, you'll allow me to win this thing, or you'll show yourself to me according to my constraints, which now I realize are flawed. He would have been enabling this. So it's a good thing he didn't do this for me. So what really helped me was not asking that question, but really exploring the question in a more open-minded way and saying sort of, what sort of evidence would I expect to find if God existed or if this was true, and how would I come to know it? And that led me down this path of trying to learn a little bit about epistemology, ontology, these other sorts of things, studying a little bit more about philosophy. So that was really the case. And the other thing I'll mention too is I really wasn't looking in good faith. I wanted answers and truth so I could look and be smarter than everyone else. I was trying to be my own. Basically, I was trying to be God. So I'll have this. This is another sort of embarrassing sort of reason. But these were, I think, reasons why I'm really glad God doesn't allow some sort of scientific experiment to be done to demonstrate his existence conclusively. Because this is like saying God is now subject to the scientific method. And then the scientific method becomes God because we subject our belief in God, whether or not he conforms to the scientific method, rather than whether or not God actually exists or whether it is true that God exists. So once again, this is not going to be an argument that convinces people that God exists, but this shook my confidence in the idea that there wasn't enough evidence for God existing. The next reason that I would give was that moral realism is separable from God. And really, whether or not you believe moral realism is something that depends on God, whether it's more likely that God exists or not, what I want you to realize, and what I had sort of uncritically accepted, was an assumption implicitly that moral realism and God were separate, that one doesn't need to have God exist to know what good is and for good to exist. And I will say that in and of itself is an assumption, and once again, the assumption that I uncritically bought into. And I should mention this is not historically the case at all. So G.E.M. Anscombe's paper, Modern Moral Philosophy, really challenges this idea that morality and God are separate. And what I started wondering was, wait a minute, this idea that moral realism and God are separate, is this really just due to certain thinkers like Voltaire, who often distorted history to push an anti-religious agenda? So I think what I started realizing is a lot of the people that established what we now see in culture, which is a separation between God and morality, most of these people were coming off of things that seemed really bad when it came to religion, like religious wars. And as a result, they needed to try out, they were like, oh my gosh, if we just free ourselves from religion, this is what Bertrand Russell said, we will now be able to be moral people. But once again, there's an implicit presupposition that morality and can function independently of the existence of God, and that this will happen. And I will say, practically, this was debunked by sort of non-religious and anti-religious violence in the last century. So you can look at things like the Soviet Union, the communist revolution in China, and these sorts of things. So there's the philosophical reasons that will convince you, okay, well, maybe it's the case that God is necessary for moral realism, and there are very strong reasons to believe this. And then there's also the practical reasons of, hey, look, people have tried morality, anti-religious morality, morality separated from God, and it doesn't really turn out that well. So these are two separate reasons, but both of those, I think, were things I needed to question. The real book, and I know I talk about this book all the time, but After Virtue really put the nail in the coffin that, to me, that moral realism was something that was even a coherent idea outside of the existence of God or a God-like entity that could provide teleology. I've talked about that a bunch here on the channel. And then there's other things I've talked about. So see some of my other videos, things like Hume's is-ought distinction, G.E. Moore's open question argument, learning a little bit of philosophy. I learned moral philosophy from George Scher, a little bit of it. Not, I don't have a degree or anything, but I learned enough and did a lot of reading. People like J.L. Mackie. These were really good readings that I had that really challenged my traditional idea that good can exist without God, that these are separable concepts. That was an assumption, and I came to realize, wait a minute, I assume this not for good reasons, and perhaps that's not true. The last reason, this is a little bit meta, but was the idea that reason itself is separable from the existence of God. So this was, once again, another assumption that I had sort of bought into. And I should also mention, this is another one that historically is not the case. So you look at philosophers like Augustine, Aquinas, Locke, Descartes. These are all people that thought that reason is somehow contingent upon God. And thinking that God, that we reason our way to God, or we sort of come to moral conclusions outside of God, is really pushing God away into this small corner, as opposed to really thinking about how big of an entity or how great of an entity God is. Like everything, if we think about it, if we look at Aquinas' arguments, is contingent upon God. And this means our own moral faculties, our own faculties of reason. These were things I'd sort of accepted uncritically again. So one of the things would be arguments about free will and the existence of reason itself under naturalism. So you have Alvin Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism, which basically argues that and Plantinga's thought's very interesting, because he argues that there's a sort of deontological component to epistemology, that there's a duty to look at the evidence and try to do your best to look through alternatives. But one of the things would be free will. Under naturalism, there is no free will, because one essay that I read was basically arguing for free will to exist, your mind has to be able to be its own sort of prime mover. It has to be able to reason its way. It has to be able to make choices that are not causally closed. So if naturalism is true, we actually don't have causal control over our minds. It's only illusory. These are all things that I hadn't really taken to their logical conclusion, and me taking my sort of, I guess, pseudo-naturalism to its logical conclusion caused me to realize, okay, well, now moral realism's out the window, which I thought was fine. Now free will, and then now, the existence of reason itself is coming under question. Oh my goodness, these are all things that are causing me to start realizing that maybe I shouldn't be so confident in my naturalism. One really interesting book here, and I haven't finished this book because it's really long. It's like a massive tome. But Charles Taylor's Secular Age, it basically makes the claim that our modern culture, which imagines itself to be neutral, that secularity itself is in some ways sort of culturally constructed thing. And it acts as if it's objective and free from any historical or cultural forces, but that's not the case. So what Charles Taylor is arguing is that people look now back at Christian countries and said, oh, these people believed in Christianity or whatever because they were socialized into a Christian culture. And now we're able to be objective because we don't live in a culture that is predominantly one religion or another. But what Charles Taylor is saying is there are a lot of assumptions that come into living in our culture that makes this assumption. That's based on assumptions that aren't always rationally justified. And these are not free from historical or cultural forces. And I mentioned people like Voltaire and the historical pushes in academia for these reasons, people like Bertrand Russell, who were very, very influential. And once again, just really questioning this will kind of led me to really start thinking about these things a bit better, or a bit more deeply, which I think is better. One thing I would say is, look, if God exists and reason is just either part of his character or something that he created that's contingent upon him, it'd be weird to need to prove that God existed using reason. God is, reason itself is contingent upon God. It's not that God is somehow subject to reason, because then reason would by definition be God, not God. So, and once again, this idea of God being much smaller than he actually is. And I think this idea of, okay, we should only believe in God if God can be proved reasonably is once again making reason to be our God rather than God being God. And it's kind of like, because I make music, I release music on different labels and things. It'd be like people saying, well, let me see if I can get to know you by listening to your music rather than just getting to know you personally and directly. And I think in the same way, the idea that we can reason our way to God presupposes that reason itself is not something that's contingent upon the nature of God. And just because God can be supported by reasons doesn't mean that that using reason is the only way we can come, using like the sort of objective modernity-based reason is the only way we can come to know God. So anyway, thanks for watching. Once again, let me know what you think. I think this video is going to be really interesting for the people who never were skeptical of the existence of God to think, what about somebody who was skeptical and what were their reasons? I'll leave you with is a quote by David Hume, which really kind of I really resonated with. But look, to be a philosophical skeptic is, and a man of letters, the first and foremost essential to being a sound believing Christian. So thanks for watching. And if you're a skeptic watching this, let me know what your reasons are for not believing in God. I'm curious. Like I said, I'm not here to combat you or try to convince you that you're wrong as much as just try to understand. But yeah, thanks for watching.